The 16th century poet John Lyly famously wrote that all is fair in love and war. Many would beg to differ with the former, and the founders of the Geneva Convention would most definitely disagree with the latter. The Geneva Convention was set up in 1864 by the founders of the Red Cross. Its objective was simple: to form a set of laws and guidelines that would serve to protect the innocent and defenseless in times of war. In other words, making the rules of war. Since the initial Geneva Convention was created, there have been several amendments that have opened the scope of who is protected under these international rules of war. According to the Red Cross, the rules of law exist to control what can and can't be done during war to limit unnecessary suffering and save lives. A total of 196 countries have signed the Geneva Convention, which covers every nation and state around the world, even countries that have dubious reputations for their conduct in war. If the rules of war are broken, the individuals or states responsible can be prosecuted or imprisoned. Of course, this depends largely on the international community working together and the collaboration of global police and intelligence forces. The laws of war, otherwise known as international humanitarian law, can be best summarized as the following 6 rules. The first is no intentional targeting of civilians. This also applies to anybody who is either unable to fight or has surrendered. The targeting of civilians might include bombing raids or attacks on schools, hospitals, stations, airports, and other public buildings. The next states that there should be no attacking or preventing the aid of workers and hospitals. This is widely regarded as an obvious rule, and the internationally recognized Red Cross symbol is used to denote any area being used for the treatment of injured civilians. The third rule focuses on no inhumane treatment or torture of detainees, no matter who they are. This means ensuring detainees are given food, water, and any necessary medical attention. They must also be allowed to contact families. Civilians must also be given the right to escape an area of combat. According to the Geneva Convention, warring parties should be set up for safe routes to allow people to flee areas under siege or attack. Any humanitarian service in the vicinity must also be given access to provide any necessary treatment and supplies or to carry out evacuations. This might mean allowing medical staff to perform procedures, as well as any relief workers providing food, water, or medical supplies. The final rule stipulated by the Geneva Convention is prohibiting the use of unnecessary force. This basically means that war should be fought without resorting to weapons capable of causing excessive suffering. Think landmines or forms of chemical warfare. Since its inception in 1864, the Geneva Convention has added further rules as the complexities of war and the ensuing casualties increased, especially after the first 2 world wars. The Geneva Convention was initiated by Swiss businessman Henry Dunant, who was absolutely horrified by the conditions on the European battlefields of the 19th century. Dunant realized an international agency had to be formed that would not only provide humanitarian aid to those in war, but also encourage nations to abide by agreed-upon rules of conduct. As a result, the Red Cross was set up to provide neutral humanitarian aid, while the Geneva Convention was created to establish the rules of war. After the mass destruction of World War II, the Geneva Convention was amended to remind any country involved in the war of humanitarian factors involved. After some notoriously horrific cases of human rights abuse and genocide were revealed after the war, the Geneva Convention was considered to be more important than ever in going forward. However, this all looks good on paper, but how closely are the rules of war adhered to? It would seem that some nations or states have been guilty of either stretching some of the laws or ignoring them entirely. And that's where it gets tricky, because if a state is thought to have breached international humanitarian law in some way, how are they prosecuted, if at all? The International Criminal Court, or ICC, is an independent organization based in the Netherlands. It seeks to prosecute any individuals or states thought to be guilty of committing war crimes. It was formed in 1998, taking over the role of the United Nations, whose courts previously supervised the prosecution of war crimes. The problem with the ICC is that it only has the authority to prosecute people suspected of crimes from within its member countries. It lacks the jurisdiction to press charges or put anyone on trial whose country is not aligned with the ICC. If anyone outside of the ICC's member countries breaches the rules of war, the ICC is pretty much powerless. It only can issue arrest warrants and hope the suspects travel to a member country where they can be legally arrested and tried. This is the case with current Russian President Vladimir Putin. In February of 2023, ICC judges issued warrants for his arrest based on evidence of war crimes during the Russian war with Ukraine. Putin is alleged to be responsible for the unlawful trafficking of Ukrainian children to Russia, where they have been adopted. Putin dismissed the charges, saying the ICC had no legitimacy in Russia, which it doesn't. Putin will remain a free man unless he ventures to an ICC member country, which has the authority to arrest him. Whether that happens remains to be seen. Russia isn't the only world power to not have signed on with the ICC. China, India, Iraq, Israel, and the United States are other significant countries missing from the members list. Just as with the United Nations, the ICC has no police force, no military of its own. Instead, it relies upon the cooperation and support of the resources and personnel of its member states. Countries such as the US, Russia, and China are reluctant to join the ICC because they feel the organization has too much power and may rule unfavorably against them when it suits them. Indeed, this has been a criticism of the ICC. Too Eurocentric and biased in its prosecution of individuals from weaker states, notably in war-torn African countries. Still, the greatest example of people being successfully brought to trial for breaching the rules of war was when the United States and NATO intervened in the Yugoslavian wars in the 1990s. Several individuals were charged with counts of genocide and what were to be considered the worst atrocities in Europe since World War II. These criminals were charged in the United Nations courts. However, it is unlikely that they would have all been brought to justice if it weren't for the military muscle of the US. Since then, the prosecution of people violating the rules of war has been restricted to smaller internal conflicts. What does the future hold then, for not only monitoring the rules of war, but for actual wars themselves? Massive advancements in technology have made it easier than ever to keep an eye on conflicts throughout the world. Innovations in satellite technology allow organizations such as the ICC to capture evidence of any wrongdoings that are clear breaches of humanitarian laws. Unfortunately, after a stable period of declining war-related deaths, the world is currently experiencing a surge in conflict fatalities. At the beginning of the 21st century, global deaths from war averaged around 100,000 per year. But with recent conflicts in Ukraine, Ethiopia, Syria, and Gaza, that number shot up to well over 200,000 in 2023. In many of these cases, the rules of war have been blatantly disregarded, and yet the ICC can only watch on. So how to police the rules of war if the big players won't even come to the table? Getting at least some of the major nations to either jump on board with the ICC or work towards creating a new, more global watchdog seems to be the way forward. Many are demanding a more globally focused organization, and they would do the job better. The same applies to an international committee that prosecutes war criminals. Perhaps a more global body would coerce more cooperation. The key may be getting America and China to agree on some kind of international system of policing war laws. This alliance would not only bring a massive supply of force, but also the power of severe punishments in the form of sanctions. Of course, this might just be wishful thinking. Any nation or state agreeing to join a global humanitarian law body would obviously also have to be held accountable for their own actions. One thing is for sure, if more nations agree that working together is ultimately easier than working against each other, well, then we might see more global cooperation in the future.